Good afternoon, Chautauqua. I'm Rob Wilson-Black, Director of Religion here at the Chautauqua Institution. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Hall of Philosophy for day one of week 7 of the 2026 Interfaith Lecture Series. Before welcoming to the microphone our beloved CEO, Keogh, who will introduce our speaker, my favorite former Prime Minister, the Honorable Kevin Rudd, I ask you to please consult the Chautauquan Daily newspaper for details about the outstanding and varied programs of the Department of Religion, in addition to these wonderful interfaith lectures Monday through Thursday at 2 p.m. Please recall that this Friday at 9:15 a.m., we will have ecumenical communion here in the Hall of Philosophy. Preaching this week will be the Reverend Julie Wilson-Black, whom I know very well. She's a Presbyterian minister in Alexandria, Virginia. Then there's the 12:30 prayer in the Hall of Christ, only at Chautauqua, Juma prayer in the Hall of Christ. And at 5 p.m., the Hebrew congregation's wonderful Shabbat service, which I never miss, Bell Tower Park. Everyone's warmly welcome to these Abrahamic Friday events, whether you're part of that particular faith community or not. We're proud of that at Chautauqua. You can just come and learn or be part of it. Kyle will be moderating the Q&A following today's discussion, followed by a book signing at the Hall of Missions to my left. You can purchase books at the Octagon Bookshop, also to my left. I've already purchased mine from the bookstore. Please submit your questions online via questions.chq.org or on an old-fashioned slip of paper that our ushers will help you get to the conclusion of the lecture. You may know this, but I have to tell you, the nearest restrooms are underneath the Hall of Philosophy on the Cookman Avenue side. Assistive listening devices are available. For any additional accommodation, please let us know via the ushers. We want to make sure you're comfortable. Finally, please silence your cell phones, as I have just done mine, and no flash photography, as if I even know what that is. For those joining us via Chautauqua's YouTube channel, thank you. To view the live captions during today's lecture, visit captions.chq.org on any internet-connected mobile device. Our religion theme for the week is religion, power, and the moral stakes of a changing global order. Within the overall theme of week 7, global power and our evolving international order. This program is made possible by the H. Parker and Emma O. Sharp Lectureship Fund. I now welcome the Chautauqua Institution's CEO, Keogh, to introduce our speaker today.
Thank you, Rob. It's so great to see all of you here, and so fantastic that the weather has cleared for us this afternoon to allow so many folks outside in the Grove. Our speaker today is the Honorable Dr. Kevin Rudd, AC. He previously served as Australia's 26th Prime Minister from 2007 to 2010. I think that's a first here. At least I've definitely not heard that in my time. Then he served as Foreign Minister from 2010 to 2012 before, can you believe this? Returning as Prime Minister. Who does that? Rob, you didn't tell me there'd be hecklers. Dr. Rudd is leading the international authority as a leading international authority on China. He currently serves as the global president and CEO of the Asia Society. The Asia Society was established in New York in 1956. It's about half as old as we are, and now operates across 16 centers with more than 250 staff around the world. Dr. Rudd is also the founding president of the Asia Society Policy Institute, a think and do tank focused on U.S. Asia relations. Dr. Rudd returned to lead the Asia Society in March 2026, following 3 years as Australia's ambassador to the United States under the Trump and Biden administrations. He recently published 2 books on U.S. China relations, on Xi Jinping and the Avoidable War, which have been translated into more than 7 languages. Dr. Rudd is professionally proficient in Mandarin Chinese, feel free to test him, and was awarded his doctorate of philosophy from Oxford University for his dissertation on Chinese President Xi Jinping's ideology worldwide. Over the years, he has been extensively cited on China relations, appearing frequently on U.S. network television, in print media, including the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and the Financial Times, and across the major outlets in India, Japan, and Europe. We are honored to have him today, and please give a huge Chautauqua welcome to Dr. Kevin Rudd.
Thank you very much, and thank you to my sole Australian supporter here. G'day. It's so wonderful to be in this place you call the Hall of Philosophy. The folks who are here just with me, their names is Plato, that's Aristotle. You just call me Zeus, it's okay. It's a remarkable place, and thank you all for coming and for being among us. This coming Friday, it will be 90 years to the day since America's 32nd president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, delivered his historic address, "I Hate War," to the 1936 Chautauqua Summer Assembly. In preparing this lecture for what is the 152nd or the 153rd Assembly? 152nd Assembly, I watched once again that grainy black and white footage of FDR as he stood before his audience for 20 agonizing minutes as one who had been struck down by polio 15 years before. A remarkable man. It is as if FDR, a truly great American president, was speaking to us afresh. FDR said way back then that and I quote him, "In the hurly-burly of domestic politics, it is important that our people should not overlook problems and issues which, though they lie beyond our borders, may and probably will have a vital influence on the United States in the future." FDR continued, I quote him again, "I am more concerned," said FDR, "and less cheerful about international conditions than about our immediate domestic prospects." You're still just coming out of the Depression then, remember that. I say this to you, my fellow Americans, not as a confirmed pessimist, but as one who still hopes that envy, hatred, and malice among nations have reached their peak and will be succeeded by a new tide of peace and goodwill. And I say this as one who has participated in many of the decisions of peace and war before, during, and after the World War, meaning World War I. One who has travelled much, one who has spent a goodly proportion of every 24 hours in the study of foreign relations. Back in 1936, FDR was right to be less than cheerful. His "I Hate War" speech was delivered only 3 years after Hitler came to power in 1933 in Germany. It was delivered less than a year before the full-scale Japanese invasion of China in 1937, and barely 5 years before that day of infamy, the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. For FDR, his hopes for America were noble, while the international political realities he faced were dismal. Both his hopes and his fears have been shaped by his experience as Assistant Secretary for the Navy during the Great War under President Woodrow Wilson. Wilson himself had been an idealist who wished, in fact, for the Great War to indeed be the war that ended all wars. Once again, as FDR told this gathering all those years ago, and I quote him again, "I have seen war. I have seen war on land and sea. I have seen blood running from the wounded. I have seen men coughing out their gassed lungs. I have seen the dead in the mud. I have seen cities destroyed. I have seen 200 limping, exhausted men come out of the line, the survivors of a regiment of 1,000 that went forward 48 hours before. I have seen children starving. I have seen the agony of mothers and wives. I hate war." The world had emerged from the combined horrors of the Great War, and then, barely a decade later, the Great Depression. FDR, forever looking for the best in humanity rather than the worst, confronted a world infinitely more difficult, dangerous, and complex than our present and somewhat more pampered age. It caused him to reflect on why men routinely chose to destroy one another and what might be done about it. As he argued again at the time, there are many causes that produce war. There are ancient hatreds, turbulent frontiers, the legacy of old forgotten, far-off things and battles long ago. There are newborn fanaticisms, convictions on the part of certain peoples that they have become the unique depositories of ultimate right and truth. A dark old world was devastated by wars between conflicting religions. A dark modern world faces wars between conflicting economic and political fanaticisms, in which are intertwined race hatreds. So said FDR, a great man. FDR could just as easily have been speaking to our own age as of the state of the world nearly a century ago. To borrow FDR's words, we too can see ancient hatreds and turbulent frontiers, as in Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine. We also see newborn fanaticisms in our modern age, just as we see those both at home and abroad who believe their convictions, to quote him again, have become the unique depositories of ultimate right and truth, unquote. FDR and Churchill had outlined the principles of the post-war international order in the Atlantic Charter of August 41. Their objective was to agree on certain common principles in the national policies of their respective countries on which they based their hopes for a better future for the world. Importantly, the Charter agreed that they respect the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they live. It stated that they wished to see sovereign rights and self-government restored to those who have been forcibly deprived of them. It also stated that after the destruction of the Nazi tyranny, they hoped to see established a peace which will afford to all nations the means of dwelling in safety within their boundaries, and which will afford assurance that all the men in all the lands may live out their lives in freedom from fear and freedom from want. Over the next 7 years, these bilateral arrangements between the United States and the United Kingdom would become reflected in a set of universal norms, principles, and institutions. First, the UN Charter, concluded at the San Francisco Conference in 1945, that agreed on the rights of sovereign states to be free from the fear of foreign invasion and the scourge of war. Second, the Bretton Woods agreements concluded in 1944 that established the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and then in 1947 the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade to give collective effect to the international community's common economic agenda. And third, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 that enshrined the intrinsic dignity of the human person, their universal right to individual freedom, and their right to choose their own governments. Harry Truman, Roosevelt's vice president, would take over the task when FDR finally went to meet his maker in April of 1945 at far too young an age. American officials, in partnership with U.S. allies, including those of my own country, then painstakingly worked their way through the founding documents of what would become the institutional, procedural, and normative underpinnings of the post-war international order. FDR's widow, the formidable Eleanor Roosevelt, who also spoke here at Chautauqua on many occasions, including her remarkable 1933 address on the new responsibility of women, would go on to chair the UN working group that drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Some lady. And a Chautauqua lady. 8 times she was here. It is hard for a modern audience to understand how revolutionary this global rules-based order was for the time. States, for the first time, were to be constrained in their external behaviour against other states, particularly in the arbitrary use of force. States were also to be constrained in their internal behaviour towards their citizens, as universal political and economic rights became entrenched in international instruments which authoritarian governments have sought to unravel ever since. Furthermore, as the Soviet Union militarily occupied Eastern Europe between 1945 and 1947, and as China supported North Korea's military invasion of the South in 1950, the United States under Truman then resolved to establish a network of bilateral and plurilateral mutual defense treaties to respond to the core questions of hard security, both in the Atlantic and in the Pacific. In other words, the United States, in framing the new global rules-based order, embraced simultaneously three core principles. First, after 2 world wars had ravaged the planet within the space of barely a quarter of a century, it was time for the United States to lead this new global order, not to ignore it, not to isolate itself from it. In the end, Americans finally agreed with John Donne that no man was an island. Nor, for that matter, was any country an island, and that included America. We were all indeed connected. Second, the form that this new global rules-based order would take would be predicated on both the inalienable and universal rights of the individual, as well as the sovereign rights of states to be protected against armed attack. And third, to bolster the soft security offered by this new international system to member states, the US was also sufficiently principled and sufficiently pragmatic to engage also in the business of hard security, to confront authoritarian states which in many cases sought to undermine the system from the get-go. These then were the essential features of the post-war order. By no means perfect, but demonstrably better than what had preceded it, even if only measured by the fact that there has been no global war in more than 80 years, although at times we've come close. So what are the ethical underpinnings of what some have called this liberal international order? That's one of the questions I've been asked to address in this lecture. How are they under challenge, and can they hold for the future? This is not the place for some granular exposition of the theological, intellectual, and ethical forces that were at work in the post-war world that shaped the norms and institutions of our post-war order. Instead, I'll offer some general observations on a number of the critical forces that were at work. First, at the most elemental level, the visceral global revulsion at the orgy of orchestrated violence that the war had delivered to all humankind became a moral force in its own right. C.S. Lewis's Wartime Reflections, first delivered in his radio broadcasts on the BBC and later collected in Mere Christianity, offer a remarkable insight. He points to universal moral norms whose cogency extends well beyond the constraints of national cultures and which the peoples of the world knew in their collective conscience had been fundamentally violated. Violated against individuals, violated against states, and violated against races, as seen in the horrors of the Holocaust. The world's conscience had been assaulted, and it demanded something better. So when the UN Charter speaks eloquently of the galvanizing imperative of avoiding once again the scourge of war, it speaks to the depths of this post-war moral anguish. And I'd love a glass of water if I can get one. Scotch would do. I am Australian, so sorry about that. This reflected a profound moral impulse, proceeding from the deepest awareness that our consciences had not only been violated, but deracinated as a result of the war. And this in turn produced thank you, that's wonderful. This in turn had produced a form of spiritual and secular call to repentance on behalf of us all, to create something radically better. Second, the notion of the intrinsic, inalienable, and universal dignity of the human person and the resulting obligation of states to protect the rights of each person comes from two sources. Sources that are often seen as being in conflict with each other rather than as reinforcing each other. One, of course, is the secular Enlightenment and the various declarations of the rights of man that have proceeded from it. But on closer inspection, there is also a second source as well, and that is the cumulative contribution of millennia of Christian belief, as well as parallel forms of religious belief beyond the Christian communion concerning fundamental human dignity. The notion that an individual human being has an intrinsic human dignity proceeds from the belief that each person is seen to carry with them the divine spark of a creator God, and as a consequence, shaping the sanctity of human life. On this question, therefore, the Christian teaching on the dignity of man has positively shaped the findings of the Enlightenment project. This is seen, for example, in the animating principle behind Pope Leo XIV's recent encyclical, Magnificat Humanitas, on the impact of artificial intelligence on the dignity of the human person, on the dignity of human consciousness, on the dignity of human conscience, on the dignity of human agency rather than the agency of machines, on dignified human relationships, and on the dignity of human work. After all, beyond simply asserting that human beings possess an intrinsic dignity which should be respected and protected, where else does this conviction ultimately come from? Marxist-Leninists have traditionally approached this question quite differently. I'm a student of China, treating human beings primarily as material things, whose historical significance derives from the social and economic class to which they belong. This marks a fundamental divide between a Marxist materialist view of the human person and the combined Judeo-Christian and liberal Enlightenment tradition. Within the UN system, we see the questions of human dignity alive in the UN Charter itself, in Eleanor's UN Declaration on Human Rights, in the UN Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, in the Convention relating to the status of refugees, and in individual UN conventions providing normative and institutional structures for protecting the rights of women, children, and persons with disabilities, as well as conventions against human slavery. So while the sons of the Enlightenment may have fought the fathers of the Church for over 300 years over the proper relationship between crown and altar, between church and state, I argue that Christian belief on the inalienable dignity of the human person has in reality been translated into the Enlightenment belief in the inalienable rights of the individual. There should be no conflict, faith and reason, as Thomas Aquinas argued. A third factor on the moral foundations of the global rules-based order is that the UN Charter's social and economic covenants also come from both the Christian and the Enlightenment traditions. FDR spoke of freedom from want as one of his 4 freedoms. In the Christian tradition, this proceeds from the ethical imperatives outlined in the Gospels. So too with social democrats over the last 150 years, of which I am one, as they sought to thread the needle between Christian and Enlightenment traditions of social justice. In the Christian tradition, we see these principles alive in the Sermon on the Mount, the parable of the rich young man, the teaching in Matthew on the final judgment, and whether you have fed the hungry and clothed the naked, the prophetic traditions of Micah and the injunction to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God, and the constant preferencing of the poor and the powerless across all the scriptures, not just 1 or 2, across all the scriptures. The concept of freedom from want proceeds from all these principles, which are found across the Bible. So too with the most basic precepts of social and economic equality. In the history of the Catholic Church, we see this with Pope Leo XIII's great encyclical Rerum Novarum in 1891, as the Church finally caught up with the horrors of the Industrial Revolution. We see it 100 years later with Pope John Paul the Great's Centesimus Annus. We also see it in the birth of labour unions, labour parties, and social democratic parties around the world. And in the post-war international order, we see it in the economic and social chapters of the UN Charter, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and in the poverty reduction missions of the World Bank. Once again, there is both a Christian and an Enlightenment thread running through all of the above. Fourth, there is the creation itself, and you have a most beautiful part of the creation here in Chautauqua. God did well here. The creation itself, our common environment, our responsibility to other living things, and the kind of planet we would bequeath to those who come after us as a matter of intergenerational justice. Here the Christian tradition is richer than the Old Testament traditions that preceded it. Christians would argue that our mission is not simply to subdue the earth, rather it is to steward the earth. This principle is not simply to be found in some of the in some misty-eyed renditions of St. Francis's Canticle of the Creatures, his hymns to Brother Sun and Sister and Mother Earth, or his preaching to the birds, while I am a great admirer of St. Francis, there is a much deeper biblical tradition underpinning our concern for the environmental commons. It goes to the fact that the earth is God's creation, not man's, that we are tenants, not owners of the planet, and therefore, as stewards, our responsibility is to nurture the planet for all, not to exhaust it. In the last half-century, these ethical imperatives have combined with the findings of environmental science on the mounting dangers of ecological devastation and the need for sustainable development. This extends not just to climate change, where the science is clear, but also across the other great 8 planetary boundaries which cover land, our waterways, the oceans, the quality of the air that we all breathe, right across the entire global environmental commons. Within the institutions of global governance, what has emerged has been the IPCC, the International Panel of Climate Change Scientists, who do climate science, the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, on climate policy, as well as a number of individual global agreements covering everything from ozone, Antarctica, to endangered species. These proceed from the values of which I have spoken, and the science delivered on top of those values from the Enlightenment. Finally, among the ethical factors shaping the modern global order, there is the more vexed question of national and international security. Historically, the Christian Church has often had a troubled relationship with the institutions of the state in this most complex of policy domains, whether it is security within states or security between states. Even after the Edict of Milan in AD 313 established official tolerance of Christianity, and Christianity eventually becoming the religious orthodoxy of the late Roman Empire some decades later, these problems of church and state have persisted. The Roman state had once sought to eliminate Christian belief. Then the Roman state became a militant defender of the Christian faith, at times relying on the coercive power of the state to do so. Those familiar with the writings of the great Protestant theologians Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Karl Barth, and Reinhold Niebuhr will be aware of the structural tensions in this church-state relationship, particularly when it falls to the church to insert a spoke in the wheel of the state by whatever means to overcome an unfolding existential evil. Bonhoeffer's challenge to Hitler. On the question of Christian belief, ethics, and practice as they relate to external threats to the security of the state, Catholic tradition also offers the deep teachings of what is called the doctrine of the just war. Offensive war, as the Pope recently reminded the international community, does not fall within the scope of this doctrine. A defensive war, if your country is attacked, does. That is why, for example, Christian and other faith traditions support chaplaincy services for the defence forces in our collective democracies. And that is why developing our defence capabilities to act as an effective deterrent against potential aggressors is, in my argument, entirely compatible with conventional Christian teaching. But there is a world of difference between that approach on the one hand and the perverse and simplistic theology of Gott mit uns, what certain soldiers from a certain country had on their belts during World War I, on the other. God is no respecter of nations. But God, in the theology and the traditions we've inherited, accepts and embraces the proposition that if we are attacked, we have a right to defend and to deter such attacks in the first place. In all of this, we're also mindful of the injunctions of the Beatitudes of blessed be the peacemakers. The place, therefore, for diplomacy, for effective arms control, and for international law remains. But in the brutal and unstable world of what is now the second quarter of the 21st century, these instruments offered through the UN system may be necessary, but of themselves they are not sufficient to sustain a just peace. Again, we cannot simply wish away the military capabilities of authoritarian states. They exist. History tells us that authoritarian states respect strength, they are contemptuous of weakness, and appeasement can be fatal. The history of the 1930s reminds us what happens when dictators see, smell, and feel policies of appeasement in response to their capacity for aggression. For those of faith, these are often uncomfortable questions, but we cannot walk away from them, nor could FDR. Not that long after he first proclaimed from this very stage, that is, the big stage here at Chautauqua, I'll get the pronunciation right soon, of this wonderful place, I hate war. These, then, are some of the core ethical considerations that flow, however imperfectly, from the community of faith, together with the fellowship of reason, into the global rules-based order we have painfully constructed together since FDR helped lead the Allies towards victory in 1945. In summary, therefore, our moral impulses have been as follows. First, the visceral horror of war and the resulting moral determination to defend the peace. Second, the intrinsic dignity, inalienable rights, and personal freedom of each human being. Third, the social justice owed to the weak, the poor, and the oppressed. Fourth, our stewardship of the global commons. And fifth, our resolve to deter and defend against armed attacks upon our peoples by aggressors. And so what of the future? What we've been discussing so far is the ethical and institutional architecture of the global and regional rules-based order that was built out of the ashes of the Second World War. As I've noted earlier in this lecture, while there may have been many imperfections in the design of this order, it was infinitely better than the one that preceded it, because in effect, there was no order that preceded it. It may not have produced perfection, but politics is the art of the possible, and for reformists, the perfect is often the enemy of the good. It is true that many countries, both large and small, have sought to violate the norms, rules, and institutional arrangements of the order that I've just described. It is true that after 80 years, the institutions that support the order are now weaker than ever before. So let us take stock of where we now stand against what we created 80 years ago. First, the UN Security Council is increasingly deadlocked, as we've seen through the rolling crisis over Iran. Second, the UN General Assembly has become a place of performative posturing for the record, rather than a substantive chamber for political debate and policy resolution in the face of the great challenges facing the world today. Third, it is decades since we've seen a UN Secretary General with the political courage of Dag Hammarskjöld, a Swedish Lutheran whose writings reflect a profoundly Christian spirituality and ethical framework, and who was tragically killed in the Congo while trying desperately to resolve a civil war in the 60s. Or Kofi Annan, a Ghanaian Methodist, who cautioned against the invasion of Iraq because UN weapons inspectors had not found any weapons of mass destruction. Fourth, since the global financial crisis, the International Monetary Fund has become marginal to global financial stability. It is true that the World Bank is undergoing a revival under its current leadership in its contribution to global development for the world's poorest, but at the same time, the World Trade Organization has never been weaker, in part because China has ignored the rules governing industrial subsidies, and in part because the United States, with its bipartisan addiction to tariffs, has now left the institution altogether. Fifth, 10 years into the Sustainable Development Goals, they have largely failed and no longer constitute an effective framework for eliminating global poverty and lifting into prosperity those who have been marginalized. Sixth, the UN humanitarian agencies, including UNICEF, the World Food Programme, and the United Nations High Commission of Refugees, are now experiencing funding cuts of more than 25%. And just doing their day-to-day job of keeping people alive. 7, the World Health Organization failed to both prevent and then to effectively manage COVID, and the US once again has withdrawn from the WHO. 8, as for climate change, despite the inconvenient truth that dare not speak its name in Washington for fear of being labelled woke, much of the planet is now literally on fire. You may have noticed. Finally, as for the UN Human Rights Council, the normative structure which we, the international community, established to give effect to that which Eleanor Roosevelt helped establish back in 1948, it too is under existential assault. China has it in its sights, and once again the United States has now withdrawn. Against these 10 simple measures, the report card on the global rules-based order is therefore increasingly grim. As I wrote in a review of the UN multilateral system a decade ago, it's not as if the UN will be formally abolished anytime soon. Rather, as I warned back then, the risk is that the world increasingly walks around the rules-based order that together we've so painstakingly created. We see this, for example, in its failed efforts to produce the beginnings of an effective regulatory regime for artificial intelligence. This is despite the real-world threats of frontier models, both in China with Kimi K3 and in the United States with Hugging Face, escaping their sandboxes. And while escaping a sandbox may sound exotic, the potential autonomous destruction of cyber protections around the world by both state and non-state actors is a real and present danger to our most basic infrastructure and our people who rely upon that infrastructure to function. The UN multilateral system, rather than being abolished, is increasingly simply fading away. It is dying the death of 1,000 cuts and looks increasingly like the League of Nations during its later years. I remarked earlier in this lecture that notwithstanding the near-death experience of the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, the one thing for which we must be grateful is that for all these flaws so far we have avoided World War III. That is no small thing, but the risk of global war remains stark as the habits of dialogue weaken and the temptations of appeasement grow. So what about the second quarter of the 21st century? If the trajectories we see at present for the global rules-based order continue, there is a grave risk that it degenerates into inertia and then entropy. The UN multilateral system could just fade into obscurity, much as the institutions of the Holy Roman Empire, for those of you who remember it, no one in this room, before Napoleon finally abolished it formally in 1806. It'd been around for 1,000 years by then. In other words, the machinery might formally remain of the United Nations system, but increasingly become a Potemkin village, while real decisions in the real world are taken elsewhere. Apart from what is left of the multilateral order, there is a question also for America on what role it sees for itself as a global leader of what remains of the international order. I am not an American. You may have picked that up from my accent. I'm not here to preach to you. I'm not a preacher. And that would be inappropriate. I'm a foreigner in your midst. Thank you for making me feel welcome. But it is clear to all of us who are long-standing friends and allies of this country that there is now a visceral debate engaging the entire American body politic and the nation's deepest soul about your future role in the world. The parameters of this debate range from avoiding foreign entanglements, as some of the founding fathers warned, to a broader retreat into splendid isolation. Another tenet in the debate is whether America retreats from the world and seeks only to be a hegemon within its own hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere. There is a third fault line which says beyond the Western Hemisphere, America cannot retreat from the Pacific, where its island states and territories, by definition, mean that America remains a quintessentially Pacific power. A fourth thread in this rolling national debate is about America's future in Europe and the burdens and obligations the US took upon itself on the beaches of Normandy and at the birth of NATO. And finally, there is a discourse about America might still being interested in breathing future life back into the institutions of the global rules-based system itself, which, after all, were largely the product of American diplomatic handiwork in the first place, under Roosevelt, then Truman, then Eisenhower, a genuine bipartisan enterprise. None of us know how these debates will land here in America. You're a robust democracy. You are a loud democracy. You're a very noisy democracy. You are an Australian democracy, therefore. And these are matters for your own domestic, political and constitutional processes, and we wish you well in them. And the world awaits how you resolve these. But the news for America today is that there is now a challenger to American-led world order, and that is the People's Republic of China. I've been a student of China now for 50 years, since as a 17-year-old, choosing not to pursue a career in Australian animal husbandry, I learnt Chinese instead. It was a safe way off the farm. This is not just the product of China's enhanced military power, given that it now boasts the largest surface fleet in the world and is now, according to the Pentagon, America's single pacing challenge. It is not just because China is now the second largest economy in the world, nor is it simply because China, as of a decade ago, entered formally into the race to catch up with the United States and the rest of the world in cutting-edge advanced technologies, and that a decade later they have in large part succeeded. Indeed, there are only two AI powers in the world today, the United States and China. It is not just because of these accumulations of national power that China's leadership now senses that its time in the sun has come. It is also because they have internally concluded that America is increasingly a spent force. That's the Chinese conclusion. I read their stuff. That's what they say. For example, when Xi Jinping speaks of the rise of the East and the decline of the West, that is his euphemism about China's rise and America's decline. And this is not seen as a long-term historical aspiration. It is now translated into real and historic time. And within that frame, they see artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and nuclear fusion, their priorities in the technology plan they've laid out for the next 10 years, as turbocharging China's relentless progress, not just catching up with the US and the rest of the West, but in their own literature, leapfrogging them, and then bringing about a paradigm shift through which China's state capitalist model, aided by the allocative mechanisms of AI algorithms, breaks through the traditional dominance of neoclassical markets. China's internal party literature is redolent with all these themes. That's what I do for a living. I read this stuff. I wouldn't recommend it for nighttime reading. It's dense, it's turgid. For these reasons, for some years now, Xi Jinping has been rolling out a series of global initiatives whose medium to long-term objective is to change both the institutional and the normative structure of the international system. We've seen this across 5 major initiatives announced over the last 10 years. The Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, which is a $1 trillion-plus investment initiative across the Global South. The Global Civilization Initiative, the GCI. The Global Development Initiative, the GDI. The Global Security Initiative, the GSI. And now the Global Governance Initiative, the GGI. When you look at these proposals, each of the concepts are deliberately vague. They are vague in order to maximize political constituencies of support across the Global South. And then over time, these concepts are gradually populated with sharper meaning. They also have the added advantage in terms of how they are sold to the world as being expressly supportive of the existing institutions of the UN multilateral system, where of course China has the national advantage of being one of the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council. On closer inspection, however, what China is seeking to do gradually over time is not replace the system, but to redefine its normative structure from within. We see this, for example, the Global Security Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, the Global Civilization Initiative, but we also see it with the Global Governance Initiative. This has been reinforced by multiple draft UN resolutions over the last decade, which seeks bit by bit to chip away at the human rights infrastructure anchored in Eleanor Roosevelt's Universal Declaration on Human Rights back in 1948. It is in this area that the contrast between the pre-existing order and what Xi Jinping envisages for the future is at its sharpest. Xi Jinping's most definitive statement on what China means by the term human rights was delivered in December of 2018 on the 70th anniversary of Eleanor Roosevelt's handiwork, the Universal Declaration. Xi Jinping stated that the paramount human right was the happiness of the people. The term the people, reflected in this statement, has been chosen explicitly to contrast with liberal democratic concepts of the inalienable rights of the individual. Put more bluntly, the party is the people within the Chinese conceptual universe, and it is therefore for the party to determine the happiness of the people. Xi Jinping has also said that the rights to subsistence and development are basic human rights of paramount importance. Of course, this is clear in the context of the International Covenant on Economic and Social Rights. But at the UN General Assembly in 2021, Xi Jinping stated, quote, "We should protect and promote human rights through development, which is directly connected to people's happiness, benefit and security, as well as their well-rounded development," unquote. Furthermore, in China's internal political discourse, document number 9, released by the party more than a decade ago, it's clear in the drafting that the Chinese system is fundamentally opposed to what it describes as Western concepts of human rights. There is therefore a clear fault line in all of this between Xi's concepts of the rights of the people represented by the party on the one hand versus the inalienable rights of the individual as outlined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights on the other. What is important, particularly with a gathering such as this, is to understand what the seminal debates were within the UN system between 1946 and 1948, when the working group which Eleanor Roosevelt led had its own internal debates on the origins and content of human rights. That would be finally embraced within this declaration. China's representative at the time, albeit Republican China, not Communist China, was Ambassador P.C. Chang. Chang was not a Christian, he was a Confucian. But as he explored the notion of rights within the Chinese classical tradition, he concluded that individuals did have universal rights and that these were balanced by universal responsibilities. Chang's legal and philosophical advisor was John C.H. Wu, who was a Chinese Catholic and a frequent correspondent with the great American contemplative monk Thomas Merton. Interesting connections. John Wu's writings at the time very much reflected his view that in the tradition of Thomas Aquinas, the universal rights of which they were speaking in the context of negotiations of the Universal Declaration were the product of divine providence and the intrinsic dignity of the individual as reflected in the principles of natural law. The reason I'm making some considerable reference to Chinese participation in Eleanor Roosevelt's working group between 46 and 48 is that, contrary to CCP assertions, there was an extensive civilizational debate way back then within that group on the precise meaning of these terms, way back then. Furthermore, this working group was also made up of a whole bunch of people from the non-Western world, from China, from India, from elsewhere in Asia. The idea that the Western tradition of human rights as defined by Judeo-Christianity and the Enlightenment was somehow unilaterally imposed on the emerging countries of Asia, Latin America and Africa is not factually based. It was reached by consensus from a widespread group. We Australians were represented on the same working group. We provided the beer. Others were doing the thinking. Beer is important at a certain stage of the day. The final text of the declaration was the product of extensive internal debates and multiple drafts from the working group's leading participants, including an extensive consideration of comparative philosophy, comparative religion, and the translation of values from the language of one culture into the languages of other cultures. And finally, when the PRC finally acceded to Republican China's seat at the UN in 1971, China did not enter in any formal reservations about Republican China's previous adoption of the UN Human Rights Declaration. China voted for its adoption of the Human Rights Declaration way back in December of 1948. In fact, P.C. Chang, their ambassador, served as the vice chairman of the inaugural UN Commission on Human Rights. And at no subsequent stage has the People's Republic of China registered any formal objection to this Universal Declaration. The important thing for us all to understand here is that the language and concepts embedded in the Universal Declaration transcended traditional divides between East and West. It was no Western implant, and neither the then Soviet Union nor later the People's Republic of China formally opposed it. However, given that the human rights pillar is one of the UN's 3 pillars overall, together with peace and security and economic development, it is the human rights pillar which Chinese diplomats over the last decade have been seeking actively to redefine. To conclude, what then is to be done? The purpose of this lecture has been to outline how the current global rules-based order emerged out of the ashes of the Second World War. It has also been to outline broadly the ethical foundations of the UN's founding documents, together with the ethical foundations of America's broader role in upholding strategic stability against the rolling challenges of authoritarian states. I've also sought to describe how gravely the current global order is under challenge, and finally, I've examined where the current fault lines in global governance are likely to proceed over the next quarter of a century, and how China is actively seeking to construct an alternative order within the formal framework of the current UN multilateral system. Let me provide just several ideas about what we as the free peoples of the world might do about the above. First, it's important for the democratic world to rediscover the overwhelming strength of the virtues and values which underpin our worldview. We should not be apologizing these. These are great values. In doing so, liberal democracies need to embrace both the traditions of Judeo-Christianity as well as those of the secular Enlightenment in breathing life back into our belief structure. The idea that the underlying and deeply human values represented by faith are somehow irrelevant to the current framing of debates about intrinsic human dignity, human freedom, and freedom from want is frankly just an historical absurdity. Similarly, the Judeo-Christian tradition needs to have about itself an appropriate intellectual modesty about how slow the church has been in modern history to embrace political reform, the extent of the democratic franchise, the liberation of people from slavery, as well as the imperatives of social justice. In other words, both secular and religious traditions, those which have emerged in the democratic world over the last several centuries, need to get beyond the barricades and start working together in a fundamental way. The bonds between them are now rich, and the common authoritarian adversaries we face are real. Second, in this country, the United States, I would encourage all Americans, both of the left and the right, to re-embrace the imperative of American leadership in the world. Nature abhors a vacuum, and if a vacuum is left, others will fill it. I am not politically naive about these things. It will take skill of the type that FDR was most able to deploy in this forum all those years ago to marshal a political argument for the American domestic body politic to once again become the light on the hill for the world at large. This is not just political idealism on my part. It is also anchored in economic realism for the simple reason that America now needs the rest of the free world as much as the free world needs America. You're not that big anymore. Once upon a time, you could do without us. Now you can't. We actually need to get together. Team freedom. Third, if America continues to remain out to lunch on the question of the UN multilateral system, which it helped craft back in 44-45, then the other democracies of both Asia and Europe, as well as those of Africa and Latin America, need to step up, work together to strengthen the normative values and operational cogency of the UN system. Prime Minister Mark Carney delivered a speech in Davos in January about the future role of middle powers. I can think of no better place to answer his challenge than to say that the other leading democracies should join Canada in not only defending the UN multilateral system, but also advancing it through the resources that UN institutions now so desperately need. Fourth, both the United States and the collective democratic world also need to reflect long and hard on the continued ethical imperatives of military deterrence. We cannot simply push these difficult subjects to one side. It is imperative that we are to sustain strategic stability for the world. We need to double down on deterrence in all its forms. This applies as much to the future of Ukraine and NATO in Europe as it does to the challenges we increasingly face through deterrence in Asia. We should all remember the lessons of Munich and appeasement. It always ends badly. And finally, the international community of faith, Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, as well as other faith traditions, need to engage in all of these debates. They are not the province of secular politicians alone. These are hard questions about which religious leaders also need to determine their positions. The hour is late, but the harvest is rich, but at present the workers are few. Let us all become labourers afresh in bringing in the harvest. Recently, my wife and Teresa and I spent a couple of weeks in Ireland. I'm of Irish extraction. I've never been to Ireland in my life. Any of you of Irish extraction? Okay. How many of you have survived Guinness? I did not. While in Ireland, my wife and I rediscovered Yeats as we drove around Sligo, Mayo and County Galway, reading from an anthology of his verse. This gathering will be familiar with his extraordinary contribution to our literary canon. Easter 1916, an Irish airman foresees his death. And then, most troubling of all, his poem, The Second Coming, written in 1919 and published in 1920. In the immediate aftermath of the catastrophes of his time, the First World War, the Russian Revolution, the Irish War of Independence, and the global flu pandemic, just to mention a few. The most bewitching of his verses is as follows. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, the blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. I feel that Yeats, like FDR, is speaking afresh to our age. Let us rediscover the passion which threw all of us in the democratic world into this collective defence of freedom in the Second World War, and in defence of the order we constructed together after the war. In the program of systematic decolonisation that followed as old empires collapsed, in the building of a global rules-based order anchored in the continuing principles of universal human rights, freedom from want, and deterrence for those who seek to destroy us all. My friends, all this lies within our grasp. I thank you.
I'll start with, is China playing three-dimensional chess while the U.S. is playing checkers?
I think the Chinese are playing two-dimensional chess, and the remarkable strength of their system is their ability to adopt a strategy and to adhere to it over a long period of time and to dedicate resources to it. The evidence of that is in the successful execution of China's 10-year-long and now 20-year-long advanced technology plan. They've literally gone from nowhere to being the world's number 2, or, frankly, on a par with the United States. The difference, of course, with all our democracies is that we change governments when we have elections, for good reasons or for bad. When I was voted out of office, obviously the reason was bad.
Okay.
But that is the hazard of our system. I would say one thing, though. What that points to is when the leadership of the free world and the leadership of the global order is now up for contest, we cannot simply say, therefore, that we simply consign that to our normal 4-yearly electoral processes. We all need permanent and continuing senior officials who survive from one administration to the next and from one government to the next in order to give effect to long-term plans and strategy. When I see the quality of the plans which have been developed here in the United States, they are first class. When I look at your capacity for execution, it is much less so. And that requires a permanent mandarinate. If you want to look at how this was done by FDR, read Walter Isaacson's account of the wise men, the people that FDR turned to in 41 to turn this country from having no effective at-scale defence industrial base, then becoming the world's munitions factory 18 months later. He achieved that by reaching out to a permanent team of senior officials and a permanent team of senior corporates, and they were left unmolested by the political process. That's what we all need to do, given the advantages of our democracies, but frankly, this being its downside.
Great. Thank you. Sort of building from that one, how can we reconstruct the global rules-based order post the next presidential election? You may have just alluded to part of that with the ongoing career folks, but is there anything you'd want to add?
I think there are two really important principles. You know Churchill's great statement about democracy, the worst system of government in the world, apart from all the others. The same is my view about the United Nations. It's the worst system of international government in the world, apart from all the others. In other words, the framework that FDR and Truman and frankly Eisenhower's team as well stitched together in the critical decade following World War II is a pretty good set of normative instruments, institutions which can function with political will and are capable of delivering real outcomes. So my appeal to an incoming administration, whether it's Democrat or Republican, I'm still in former ambassadorial mode here, only left 3 months ago, is roll into the resuscitation of each of these institutions, not just with resources, change their governance structures, make them more accountable, make them capable of delivering on the outcomes which we, the political masters of the systems we represent, set for them. That would send such a powerful message to the world. And the second principle I would say to any incoming administration is study math. I mean it in this sense. I'm not seeking to be rude. I mean it in this sense that if you look at the size of your economy and the relative size of the Chinese economy, the truth is that in the decade ahead, if China continues to grow, they will end up being the world's largest economy. So the question is, if you are seeking to have a global economy which is run on free market, open political systems and open society principles, we can only do it at scale, which means, dare I say it, you and America need Europe to create scale. America and Europe need the democracies of Asia to create scale. You need Japan, you need Korea, you need Australia, you need India, you need France, you need Germany, you need Britain, and the others. And that's the second principle. A decade ago, maybe Americans could say, yeah, they're just all foreigners. You know, allies are a pain in the you-know-where. We get that. We've heard it all. But can I just say the maths has changed. And the only way that we can prevail in this, in the systems that we've created, is to construct scale with each other. And that is doable with appropriate statesmanship.
Right. So, slightly switching, can we hope for another FDR, and who would that look like?
I got to say, you know, FDR has been an idol of mine since I was a kid. I didn't come to America until I was in my 30s, but I read a lot about the guy, not just the personal story of coming from adversary. Was FDR a saint? Of course not. No one in politics is ever a saint. It's a rough and tumble business. I've been in it. It's a rough and hard business. And so, without going to any personalities, either on the Democratic side or on the Republican side, what I do know is I've travelled around in my previous position, visiting governors across the country, red states and blue states, and meeting folks who actually care about their states, are effective in the management of their states, and are passionate about the future of America. You have a stable of people out there who are capable of doing that. They just need to be encouraged. What I often hear from Americans, though, considering highest office in this country, is the personal price is too high. And that is, you open yourself to the onslaught of social media, your family are then exposed, your partner is exposed, your children are exposed. So to the community of faith, I would simply say, whether you are Democrats or Republicans, lean into candidates who you judge to be people of good character and great competence and ability, because like St. Barnabas, the saint for encouragement, we need sons of encouragement to get behind these folks. You don't have a talent deficit. I've met so many of these guys and girls. They are great. R's and D's. They just need to be encouraged.
Great. With the fickleness of the American electorate, how can our allies and former allies rely on and trust us to confront the autocratic regimes?
Ooh.
There's some good questions here.
We take a view, because I come from a robust democracy. How many of you have ever been to Australia? Okay, the rest of you need to go, boost our tourism numbers. It's just over there, just keep going. We come here all the time, so don't tell me it's too long and too far. As I say to Americans, you know, man up, guys. It's just, you know, 2 movies and a flight, two movies and a sleep. That's right, yeah, you'll be fine. Anyway, back to the subject at hand, which is, can we navigate our way through, time and time again, foundational as opposed to marginal foreign and national security policy change on the part of the United States? The view so far on the part of your allies in Asia and in Europe is, despite difficulties and disagreements, for example, with the current administration, that we take very much a long historical view of this country. We know what this country has produced over decades and over nearly 100 years since the seminal events of the Second World War. We recall, all of us, what you did in building the order about which I spoke just before. And we know what you are capable of doing in the world for good. And so your allies take a long historical view, but the one caveat is this. There comes a point when something cracks. And wisdom and statesmanship in America will require political leaders, whether they are the next generation Republicans or Democrats, to identify when that crack could occur and to act well inside of it. And understanding as a core principle that through scale we prevail, that is America plus the free world, in Asia, in Europe, India, all democracies, that is a mark of respect and therefore would be seen as such by the rest of the democratic world. It's not as if people are queuing up here to gain a huge slice of the American market. It's simply that we're all working on the basis of the same open playing field. And we can. You guys are brilliant when it comes to high technologies, when it comes to innovation and your abilities in defense industry. I know it. I've been through Silicon Valley 1,000 times. I know your large defense firms, your small innovative defense firms. I've seen what you're capable of doing. But I go back to my principle. The way to bring in the rest of the allies next time round when you have political change is to bring your partners in and see us as on one team, because we are.
All right, as you shifted over to technology, what if the power of technology, for example, AI, quantum computing, synthetic biology, outstrips the ability of the government to control the technology, or China outstrips us?
On the, let me take the second proposition first, then let me go on to guardrails and regulation for artificial intelligence. On the naked competition between the US and Chinese systems, given what I said before, there are only two horses in this race at the moment, one powered by the American private sector, one driven by the Chinese party state, is that if you look across what's called the AI stack, from the power of computing, through the sophistication of semiconductors, through the sophistication of digital infrastructure, including the supply of energy, through to what's called the most sophisticated frontier models, through to adaptation, that is, adaptation of those models into companies in order to become more productive. Of those five, here in the United States, you are currently ahead in 3 or 4 of those 5, but not by a huge margin. And the margin is narrowing over time. The one where the Chinese are vastly ahead is in their take-up rate, their adaptation rate of a new algorithm produced under a new frontier model to firms in the actual marketplace. If you look therefore at, say, the basic balance sheet of Chinese private AI firms, on balance they're generating more revenue relative to expenditure than the Mag 7 here in the United States. That's the one area where they are currently ahead, and the others, they are to some extent behind. Where you are at your greatest advantage is the sophistication of your semiconductor industry and the ecosystem you have with TSMC, the Taiwanese company, and the Dutch lithography firms. So that's the competitive race. If you ask me where you will be in 5 years' time, I think, as Wellington said after Waterloo, this will be a near-run thing. On the question of regulation, which is the second part of the one that's just been asked, and whether guardrails to compete, there is one sign of light which came off the margins of President Trump's recent visit to Beijing to meet Xi Jinping. And that is, at the margins of that meeting, there was an agreement that the two sides now need to discuss guardrails on artificial intelligence. I mentioned in my text before, you've had 2 models which have recently, quote, escaped from their sandbox. What does that mean, by the way, in normal English? It means that it's gone from constrained and contained within a firm or a laboratory's defined system out into the broad internet and acting as an independent agent to do what it wants. That's happened twice now. One Chinese, one American, and possibly a few more minor exceptions. Now, this has sufficiently, I think, terrified people both in Beijing and in Washington to say, hold the phone, we need to talk. And to give Secretary Bessent his due, he has responsibilities as Secretary of the Treasury to now engage the Chinese on that in working group meetings between now and when the 2 presidents meet again for a summit on the 24th of September.
Thank you. we have some amazing questions here, and we're going to give them to all of you afterwards, but unfortunately we have 1 minute left. So the last question, are you optimistic or pessimistic for the future of our children and grandchildren?
Well, I have 3 kids and 3 grandkids. And our youngest granddaughter is 4 years old. Her name is Scarlett Rudd. She was named after Scarlett O'Hara, by the way. And we're huge Gone with the Wind tragics down under. We just sort of love that stuff. So I think about this a lot. And it's part of the reason why I've chosen, at the tender age of 67, to remain active, leading an American think tank, a global think tank, looking at the questions we've just been discussing. Future of deterrence between China and the United States over Taiwan, which is a sleeping danger. Second, the technology and techno-industrial race between China and the United States, and through scale we prevail. And thirdly, the subject of today's lecture, which is about the future of the global rules-based order writ large. Part of my reason personally for being engaged is simply I look at 3 little faces and I think, what am I going to leave you? So am I an optimist? I am absolutely an optimist. Otherwise, I would not be doing what I'm doing. If I didn't think I could walk into Secretary Besson's office tomorrow and say, here are some options for guardrails and AI, I wouldn't be here. If I didn't think I could walk into the British government and say, here is X, Y, and Z that can be done about Europe's own techno-industrial future, I wouldn't be here. So FDR, hope. FDR, fear. FDR, in the midst of what you guys faced in 41, if ever there was a dark time, it was then. And if you asked FDR here at Chautauqua, did I pronounce it finally the right way? No, I didn't. When he was here, back in 36, if you asked him how he felt about the future, he's not going to give you he wouldn't have given you some sort of loosey-goosey, it'll all be all right in the end speech. If you look carefully at what he said is, I hate war, it's a very considered text, and he was very mindful of what was happening in the world. But FDR, when everyone's back was against the wall, was the architect of hope, not of fear. And in my own small way, that's what I seek to be as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.